Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. So when we pick up, and we're not going to have too much review tonight, I don't think. Who knows? I might get off on a ramble, but I don't think we're going to have too much review tonight before we actually get started. But when we pick up, we're going to be picking up in 2 Kingdoms or 2 Samuel. 2 Kingdoms if you've got an Orthodox study Bible. 2 Samuel if you've got pretty much any other Bible. Chapter 21. And going from there. I don't know how far we'll get tonight. The reason I mention that is we're actually getting near the end of David's life. So what we're going to be reading tonight and from here on out, I don't think we're going to get through all of it tonight. In fact, I'm pretty much certain we're not going to get through all of it tonight. But we're now entering into, there have been sort of, as we've been reading through the life of David, we've been through several phases, right? So there's sort of his boyhood when he came and he was anointed, and when him as a young man when he faced Goliath. Then there was the period of his life when he was sort of on the run from King Saul. Then there was the period when he became king and took Jerusalem and sort of consolidated his rule. And then we just finished last time reading through and talking about the period of his life during which he again had to leave Jerusalem, leave the throne, and go on the run from his son Absalom, who had staged a coup and taken over the kingdom, and then the ensuing battles, and then everything involved in David then coming back to Jerusalem and becoming king again. And so that's pretty much where we left off last time, was that David had sort of fully returned, been fully reinstated as king, acknowledged by all of the tribes of Israel as being the king, though there was some tension and some things that went on in that. We saw him sort of mend relationships with the people he needed to after everything that had happened with Absalom's rebellion and the coup that took place. And so now we're beginning David's sort of twilight years. And he's going to be wrapping things up. We may actually get to sort of his final parting words for Israel before his death tonight. I'm not sure, but that's within the realm that we might get to. But we're now, this is now sort of the end of his life. And after this, for anybody who's curious, the men's Bible study, after we're done with the life of David, we're going to do Abraham next. We're going to go back to the book of Genesis and read and discuss the life of Abraham. But the reason why, when we were starting this Bible study, we decided to start with David is that David is pretty unique in the scriptures in that we do get this sort of panoramic view of his life. He's a man in the scriptures who we see from boyhood, young adulthood, mature adulthood, middle age, and then now his twilight years and the end of his life. We sort of see this whole sweep. And it's really rare that you get a figure where you have that much information. Even Christ in the Gospels, we have his birth, we have a couple little tidbits from his youth, but then he's 30 years old, right? So there's this sort of missing piece for people to shove all kinds of interesting conspiracy theories and stuff into. Or Moses, right? We see his birth and early childhood. We see events in young adulthood, but there's decades of his life that are sort of skipped. But with David, we get to see how this particular saint and this particular man lived in each sort of phase of his life from beginning to end. We get to see where he sinned and made mistakes. We get to see him learning. We get to see him growing. We get to see him repenting and sort of coming into becoming the King David who you now see depicted in icons. who very often has a gray beard, because it's depicting him at the end of his life, at the end of his journey, not just as the shepherd boy at the beginning of the journey. So it's this last phase now of his life, this last period that we're going to start talking about tonight, and where we're going to pick up now, unless anybody has any comments or questions or anything left over from previously. We'll be picking up in 2 Kingdoms in the Orthodox Study Bible, or 2 Samuel, just about any other Bible, chapter 21, verse 1. So seeing no objections or interpolations, I'll go ahead and get started. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David inquired before the Lord. So we'll go ahead and pause, even though that's not the end of verse 1. So there's a famine during this period after David has returned to the throne. That phrase got translated really literally into Greek, and so they translated it really literally in the Orthodox Study Bible, where it says year after year. Literally means year to year. But that means every or a bunch. It's a Hebrew idiom. So the idea is that when it says there's a famine for 3 years, you might think, well, the famine may have gotten worse and better and worse and better, or come in phases, like as Michael and I were discussing at the beginning. Right, we've been having thunderstorms here all day. Well, there hasn't literally been a thunderstorm every second of the day, right? It hasn't even been raining every second of the day. There have been little periods where the rain died off, but then it came back, right? So we often speak that way. So you can say there's a famine for 3 years, and that means just, crops failed in different places, et cetera, et cetera. The idea of adding this for 3 years, year to year, right, means it was persistent, right? Meaning there was sporadic famine and there was problems with the food supply over the course of 3 years. There were 3 solid years of famine, 3 years of no rain, 3 years of crop failure, right? 3 years of not enough food to feed the people. And so David, as we've seen him do so many times in his life, when something like this happens, his immediate response is to go to the Lord, to go to the God of Israel, to inquire as to what's going on. This isn't, right, to inquire the Lord doesn't mean he went to go and interrogate the Lord, right? He didn't go to God to say, hey, what's up with this, right? Like Israel's entitled to rain or something, or Israel's entitled to crops. And so it shouldn't be read that way. Sometimes, I know I've said this before in the Bible study, sometimes when we pray, it can kind of come across like we're reading God our list of demands, right? Give me this, give me that, give me this, give me that, right? But that's not what David is doing here. The idea here of inquiring of the Lord is that David believes that there's probably a reason why, right? There's probably a reason why. There's probably something going on that he, as the king, can correct. This is, I know I've talked about this before, but this is in the ancient world, the king was understood to be a representative and the responsible party for his people. And one of the king's main jobs, this isn't just true in Israel, this is true in all of the cultures of what's called the ancient Near East, what's now the Middle East, but in ancient times, right? So the Egyptians, the Babylonians, this is part of how they looked at kingship. The job of the king was to bring about justice. We tend to think about justice mostly in terms of criminal justice, right? So we think when we say, oh, the king's responsible for justice, that means, if somebody commits a crime, if somebody's doing something evil, if somebody's sinning, it's the king's job to go and punish them, right? But that's not what That's not at all what it meant in the ancient world. What it meant in the ancient world, justice, whether it's mishpat in Hebrew or ma'at in Egyptian, the concept of justice was that everything is in its proper place. Everything is functioning correctly. Everything is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Everything is harmonious, right? And when I say everything, that means everything, right? That's not just the people's moral behavior, right? But that everything is going the way it's supposed to be going. Not only does that include the people's moral behavior, the way they treat each other, them living up to their responsibilities to the community and to their families, to each other, to themselves, but also that the nation is protected, and most especially this includes spiritual realities. This includes the idea that the duties and obligations to God or to the gods, if we're talking about a pagan nation, are being met. Right? And so if justice isn't being established and preserved by the king, and things get out of whack, right, then bad things are going to happen, right? Something malfunctions in your car. It's not just that there's some kind of moral problem, right? It's the car's not going to function correctly. And the car not functioning correctly can be dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. So when a famine comes in the ancient world, they didn't interpret that in this sort of materialistic way. Like, oh, there must be a climate pattern changing, or there was a volcanic eruption somewhere 1,000 miles from here, and that drew this over there, and then there was that drew the Mediterranean. Mediterranean levels are down, and right? That they didn't process it in that materialistic way, right? They said there's a famine, that means something is wrong. Something is wrong in terms of justice. And we need to fix this. We need to fix this in order for things to go back to functioning properly, the harvest to come in like regular, for people to have what they need. And so David is the king, whoever the king was in any nation, but David here in Israel now, the king is the one responsible for that. The king is the one responsible for finding and fixing the problem. In pagan nations in the ancient world, they didn't have the sort of directness with their gods that David enjoyed with Yahweh, the God of Israel. So in the ancient world, the other nations primarily would have a class of priests who would do divination to try to figure out what the problem was, right? So a lot of that in the ancient Near East, in the Old Testament period and before, involved what's called extipacy, where they would read the entrails of animals that were used in sacrifices to try to get, looking for certain signs that would tell them, oh, this God is dissatisfied about this, and so we need to offer this offering, and then things will be okay. Or someone has committed this crime, we need to find him, execute him in order to, reestablish things. They would do that through different divination practices. The Romans had these secret books called the Sibylline books that were kept in one of the temples at the Palatine Hill, where there was one class of priests that were the only ones who were allowed to ever read them. And so when something happened, something went wrong, there was a military defeat, there was a famine like this, they saw a comet, right? They saw something in the astrological venue that caused them concern. They would send those priests to those books in order to consult and find out, because supposedly these books contain sort of the instructions for every possible situation that was going to unfold. And so they could tell them, and then the priest would come back with some prescription in order to correct the situation. And these were often extreme. So for example, at one point, the Romans saw a comet the priest came out and said, well, the books say we have to go and bury 3 slaves alive in the middle of the city of Rome. So they went and did it, right? So these could be extreme and bizarre kind of things. So especially in Deuteronomy, but in several places in the Torah, Israel was forbidden from doing all of this stuff, right? They were forbidden from doing any of this divination stuff, any of this kind of thing to determine what's wrong, right? This is not how they weren't to be interacting with any spirits other than God himself directly in this way. They weren't supposed to be summoning anything, no other gods. And this is not how they interacted with Yahweh, their God. They had a set way of doing that. So when something like this happened, the first recourse would be to go to the Torah itself, right? And to see, because God had spelled out for Israel, here's how you're to live, here's how you're to conduct yourself as a society, here's how your families are to arrange themselves and act. And so if it became apparent to them that, oh, there's a famine, oh, we're being invaded, oh, whatever, it would first of all be seen as, oh, this is likely a call for repentance. There's something that we haven't done, right? Because the commandments of the Torah, the reason God says when he gives them, he who does these things will live by them, he who does these things will have life, is not because God made a bunch of arbitrary rules and he's going to reward the people who keep them with life and punish the people who don't with death, but because built into God's creation, which is a product of God's own goodness and his own character, is a way of functioning. All the things that God has created have natures, including humans, and there is a way in which they function properly and function properly together that produces life. And the Torah is really God laying that out for Israel, giving that to them as a gift, right? Hey, here's the technical manual for life, the universe, and everything, right? It's not just the number 42, but here's the whole instruction manual, right? Of how this all operates. Here's what you need to follow and here's what you need to do. So something going wrong, first instinct is going to be, uh-oh, somebody's not following the instructions, right? Somebody's not following the manual. Someone's trying to use something as it's not intended, right? And that's causing this breakdown in what's happening. In cases where that was obscure, right? Or where it wasn't clear exactly what the problem was, then there was this means through what were called the Urim and the Thummim, these 2 stones that were worn on the breastplate of the high priest. And so in this case, the king, David, who's the responsible one, when it says he inquired of the Lord, this is what it means. He went to the high priest and said, I'm not clear on exactly what I need to do, so you need to let me know. And so we're not sure exactly how the Urim and the Thummim were used. We're never told exactly in the scriptures. Some people think it was something like casting lots, but since there's only 2 of them, unless you were asking a yes/no question, it's not clear how that would work, right? How you could get a vast sort of variety of answers. And as we're going to see, what's going to come back to David is going to be a little more detailed than that. So we're not totally clear on how that worked, but God set up this means for sort of ambiguous cases to help prevent the Israelites from getting involved in these practices of divination and these other practices involving these other gods and demonic spirits that would end up leading them into spiritual slavery and destruction. So to kind of remove that temptation, God supplies this other means. So this is what David is doing. David is doing the right thing. I need to know what to do about this. So I'm going to inquire of the Lord and see exactly what's going on so that I can fix it on behalf of the people. So here then, in the second part of verse 1 of chapter 21 is God's response. The Lord said, in Saul and his unrighteous house there is wrongdoing because of his bloodthirsty killings when he killed the Gibeonites. So this is actually something that Saul did back before we started reading, because we were reading the life of David. So the life of Saul and the life of David overlapped a little bit. This is something that's sort of still hanging there. So there's this evil, there's this wrongdoing, and it was particularly killings. It was particularly unjustified murders and killings. So a couple of things about that. I know we've talked about this, but this was way back in like the second Bible study when we talked about giants and people got excited in relation to Goliath. When Joshua led the people into the land in the conquest, a lot of times we don't read the book of Joshua carefully. And the less carefully you read it, the more sort of horrifying it is. In the book of Joshua, there were particular groups, there were particular tribes and clans. They're called the giant clans, the Nephilim clans. These were particular people groups that were living in Canaan. And these particular people groups, this is going to be a short summary version, these particular people groups were committing abominations. They were committing horrific acts. They were involved in sort of demonic rituals that involved sexual immorality. They were involved in human sacrifice and acts of cannibalism, sort of really horrific stuff. Right? And so those particular clans and tribes, God says they have to be wiped out. Now, that's often read as you need to go and murder all of the men, women, and children, right? But it's important to remember that membership in a tribe or a clan in the ancient world was not determined by ethnicity, because there wasn't a concept of ethnicity. So this is thousands of years before they knew there was DNA. Right? This is long before there was any concept of genetics, right? Or any of this kind of thing. So you weren't genetically a member of a giant clan or genetically a Hebrew, right? Or genetically an Israelite even. You became an Israelite by, first of all, being circumcised. So there's a ritual of initiation. And you were then brought into one of the tribes. You weren't just made a general Israelite, you were brought into one of the tribes. I think we talked about this at one point. One of the biggest biblical examples of this is Caleb, who was Joshua's fellow faithful spy, who became, when we first see him, he's identified as a Kenizzite, which literally means a dog person, but he was from one of the Canaanite tribes. He's identified as being a member of one of these Canaanite tribes. And at the end of his life, at the end of the book of Joshua, when he takes Hebron, he's identified as one of the elders of the tribe of Judah. All right, so that's not a contradiction. He has ceased being a Kenizzite. He has become a member of the tribe of Judah and then one of their elders because of his age and status. And so all of these tribes and clans had initiation rituals. Like I said, it was circumcision for the Israelites. Some of the other ones practiced different types of circumcision, and I won't go into detail on that, don't worry. But they practiced different forms of male circumcision that the Israelites practiced. But they also had other rituals. And in the case of the giant clans, these were particularly demonic rituals. And then the second piece after being circumcised was that you would eat the Passover, that primary feast, right? You would also participate in the other feasts, of course, but the key markers were circumcision, if you were male, or if you were female, being the daughter or wife of a circumcised male, and then eating the Passover, regardless of age and gender. These things are paralleled, by the way, in the understanding of the church, right? And you see this in the church's canon law, that what makes you a Christian is, first of all, being baptized. And then second of all, you have to receive the Eucharist at least once a year at the Passover, at Pascha. You have to eat the Passover. So these have literally been brought over. And this is also why you see in the very early church sources, you'll see the church itself, or Christians, being referred to as an ethnos, or being referred to as a nation, or being referred to as a people, like like we're our own tribe, separate from the other tribes of the world. It's because of that understanding of this being based on initiation. But what this all means in terms of the giant clans is that if, for example, a woman or a child who's a member of one of those giant clans is initiated into one of the tribes of Israel, or even another Canaanite people, and becomes part of that tribe, right? They are no longer of that giant clan. So the command to Joshua and to the Israelites is not directly genocide. It's what people now today call cultural genocide. It's that culture with its activities, with its demonic worship, with its sexual immorality, with its cannibalism and human sacrifice, all these things, that culture has to disappear from the face of the earth, right? Those practices, that way of life has to disappear from the face of the earth, right? Now, if it were, and this didn't happen, but if it had happened, that the Israelites had shown up and one of the giant clans had just said, okay, you're right, your God is better, we're all going to get circumcised, we're all going to become Israelites, right? Then that giant clan would have ceased to exist, right? Or if they had all said, no, our way of life is better, we hate you and your God, we're going to fight to the last man, and they ended up all dying in battle, that giant clan would be gone, right? But so what actually unfolds in Joshua, if you read it carefully, is somewhere in between that, and it varies from clan to clan, somewhere in between those two, with parts of these clans renouncing and leaving the clans, and parts of the clans who are the sort of true believers in that sort of death cult going to their deaths. That kind of demonized individuals who are identified as Nephilim in particular, going to their deaths. But when Joshua led Israel into Canaan, they were only to practice that sort of scorched earth policy. They were also supposed to destroy all the livestock, destroy the cities, destroy all the wealth, because God was trying to make it clear to them, this isn't about you getting rich. This isn't that you're the good guys and they're the bad guys, so you're going to go and kill them and take all their stuff, right? This is God saying, you're executing my judgment against these people for the horrific things they've done, right? So God is using them the way he used the fire he sent down on Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Or the way he's going to later use the Babylonians and the Assyrians to come in and discipline Israel, right? He's using them for that. And so it's not about them, and they're not allowed to take anything. But again, they're only supposed to practice that toward these specific giant clans. And the language that God uses in Deuteronomy and Joshua to convey this is, he'll say about other groups, their cup of iniquity is not full yet. They haven't done the things that these groups have. These groups have committed such horrific things that God could not allow them to go on. He could not allow the next generation of children to grow up in that kind of violent and depraved, murderous culture and be formed into those kind of adults. He could not allow them to continue piling up victims among their neighbors. Right? God, in his justice and his goodness, could not allow that to continue anymore, and he was using Israel to put a stop to it. But all of these other groups were not in that category. And so they were not to be slaughtered. They were not to, there was no total war. There was no, right, towards these other groups. And then there were some groups like the Edomites and the Moabites where God said, you're not to take a single foot of their land. Right? You're not to literally a single foot. It says with the Edomites, Deuteronomy 4, God says you're not to take a single foot's width, right, of their land or make war against them at all. They were their cousins. They were descended from Esau. And at that point, many of them were still worshiping the God of Israel. They're still worshiping Abraham's God at that point. Other things would happen later. So there were specific commands. And basically, not only, we did talk about this in our early Bible studies, Saul had failed with the Amalekites. The Amalekites were one of the giant clans, and Saul had decided to, for example, keep the Amalekite king alive and sort of parade him around as a show of how great Saul was and how powerful he was in battle. He had chosen to keep a lot of the wealth of the Amalekites. So he not only hadn't followed God's command with the Amalekites that they had to go, but he had also attacked and made war on groups that God had not commanded him to do so in order to take their stuff, right? And to enrich himself and to expand his territory. And so these Gibeonites are one of those groups who Saul had attacked. And so this has left sort of a stain, has left sort of a problem in Israel on two counts. So the first count is sort of a practical one. Saul's descendants, as we're about to see, are still sort of profiting from this, right? They're still living on land. They're still enjoying wealth that was unjustly taken and stolen from the Gibeonites. So they're sort of still profiting from their father's crimes, right? On an ongoing basis. They haven't repented of it at all. And then second, and relatedly to that lack of repentance, again and again in the Old Testament, we're told how serious it is for someone to shed blood, especially to shed innocent blood, to take another human life. Starting with the first murder, right? God says to Cain that Abel's blood is crying out to him from the ground, right? That the blood of this victim cries out from the ground. We see then again to Noah after the flood, right? He who spills man's blood, so shall his blood be spilled by man, right? That the spilling of human blood. Christ refers to the blood of all the martyrs from Abel to Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, crying out against that generation, right? So there's this persistent image of the blood of the innocent, the blood of the martyrs, calling out to God for justice, right? Which again is not vengeance, but justice. Something has to be done. This can't, how long will this continue? We see this with the souls of the martyrs under the altar in the book of Revelation, where they cry out and say, how long, O Lord, right? Because people are still being martyred. People are still being killed unjustly. They're saying, how long are you going to let this go on, Lord? And the answer is not forever, right? Not forever. God will put an end to evil, but it's calling out. And so there's this element here too. It says at one point in the Torah that on the day of judgment, when all of us stand before Christ, God is going to require an accounting for the blood of every person, not only from any person who took their life, but he's even going to demand an accounting for the life of every person from every animal. right? And we shouldn't take that literally. Like literally, there's going to be like lions and bears and stuff that are going to get drunk in front of the judgment seat, to account for the people they ate. But it's God saying how serious this is, right? How serious this is. That this is something, the taking of another human life willingly and participating in that as the descendants of Saul are, by profiting from it, by deriving success and pleasure from it unrepentantly, that this is something that is not going to be let slide. It's something that's not going to be overlooked, right? It's something that no matter what we as humans want to tell ourselves, we're not going to get away with. We may think we have, but we're not going to. So this is a very serious thing. So God is telling David, you want to know what the problem is? This is the problem, right? This is the problem. You're the king. It's your job to establish justice. And this is where things have gone out of whack. This is where things have gone awry. I'm staying true to form. We're now like 40 minutes into the Bible study. We're about to start verse 2, but okay. So King David called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not sons of Israel, but belonged to the remnants of the Amorites. The sons of Israel had sworn protection to them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. So that's basically telling you there, right, that there had been this agreement. They were one of the groups that Israel was not going to attack, but Saul had done this nonetheless. Now notice, it's not in his zeal for the Lord, right? It's not in his zeal to fulfill God's commands. It's his zeal for the people of Israel, for the people, right? So this was Saul acting as politician, trying to enlarge his borders, give land to the people, and ingratiate and please them. And that's probably the best spin, the nicest way you can put it, rather than saying he did it for greed or lust for power or something like that. So David calls for the Gibeonites to come before him. David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? And with what shall I make atonement so that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord?" So notice how David phrases this, right? Notice how David phrases this. How does David understand what the problem is? It's not just that there's a crime committed that must be punished, right? He doesn't call for the descendants of Saul immediately, right? He calls for the people who have been wronged, and he asks them, what do we need to do to make this right? Right? The word that's translated atonement here, I definitely won't go down that rabbit hole right now, but it literally means to cover. What do I need to do to cover this over? It's sort of literally what it means, right? He's not talking about what do I need to do to offer atonement to God for the sin. He wouldn't be asking the Gibeonites about that. He'd be asking the high priest, or he'd be asking God, right? He's saying, what do I need to cover this over? What do I need to patch this up? What do I need to do to make this right? Why? So that they will rejoice in the inheritance of the Lord, right? The inheritance of the Lord is Israel. So David's saying, what do I need to do so that you will not curse us, but you'll bless us, right? We won't be those horrible Israelites who have persecuted and betrayed and harmed us, but, right, you will have this positive, right, reaction to us. So David very much understands how God is operating here. This may well be something he learned in the whole affair with Bathsheba, right? because God is the one who ultimately, if the king fails to do his job, the king's job of restoring justice is really part of his imaging God himself. But if the king fails to do that, God can do it directly. God will hear the cry of the orphan and the widow and the persecuted and the unjustly harmed, and he'll take care of it if he has to. And so David understands that Israel has some victims. The people who he leads have some victims. In this case, the Gibeonites. They've been victims of Israel. And those victims are crying out to Yahweh, the God of Israel, for justice against Israel, right? And David understands they're entitled to it because they were legitimately wronged. Right? And so David sees the issue as, right, what's going on with atonement here and the restoration of justice is going to be to give them a better report, right? To have it so that instead of crying out to God for justice against Israel, they'll be praising and blessing God and rejoicing to God for Israel. And this dynamic is what the book of Hebrews refers to. I won't go too deeply into this, but what the book of Hebrews refers to, since we're coming up on Holy Week, as Christ's blood speaking a better word than that of Abel, right? Because Abel, remember, his blood cries out for justice. Christ's blood, on the other hand, intercedes for us. It calls out for forgiveness and for blessings and healing and restoration. So David wants to turn the Gibeonites from one to the other. He sees that is the way to correct this. Whereas if David didn't do this, right, the famine is again sort of this raw distributive justice, right? You killed the Gibeonites and took what was theirs, so God takes the crops that would have been the Israelites. And famine probably would have resulted in some deaths, right? So we're going to balance it out by you're going to reap what you sowed, right? And so David, by interceding and intervening here, is trying to now correct the situation, and so that will no longer be required. Verse 4, and the Gibeonites said to him, we will have no silver or gold from Saul or from his house, nor shall you kill any man in Israel for us. Okay? So the Gibeonites are definitely not Giant Clan type people, right? Because these are things they could have asked for. The things they say, right? They could have said, well, we want all the silver and gold. We want land back. We want the wealth back that you took from us, right? It was restore to us what you paid. And that wouldn't be injustice, right? That would be just, you took from us. I mean, that's what's in the Torah. If you steal something, you have to give back 5 times what you stole to restore the situation, right? So they would have been perfectly just to have asked for silver and gold to repay what was stolen from them. Again, Gibeonites were killed. Gibeonites were attacked and killed. They would be within their rights to say, those people who attacked us and who killed our people, we want to see them executed for their crimes, right? Raw justice, that level of strict justice, asking for the death penalty for the people who murdered their people, that would have been within their rights. But they say, we don't want either of those things. We don't want either of those things. So David said, what do you want me to do for you? Then they answered the king, as for the man who consumed us and pursued us, who deceived us to destroy us, let us blot him out from remaining in any of the territories of Israel. Let 7 men of his descendants be delivered to us, and we will hang them in broad daylight before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord chose. So they say, we don't want blood for blood, but the particular, right? They don't even want all of Saul's family. They don't say, we want every man, woman, and child from Saul's family. They say, we want 7 of his descendants, the ones who are party to this, the ones who were part of it, part of planning it, were unrepentant about it, haven't done anything about it, right? We want you to give them to us to, not we want you to execute them, but we want you to give them to us so that we can respond with the punishment for their crimes, right? And we'll take just 7, and we'll consider that things have been restored. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Meholathite. And he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites. They hanged them on the hill before the Lord. So they fell, all 7 together, and were put to death in the days of harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of barley harvest. So David, remember, had sworn this oath to Jonathan that he would not wipe out Jonathan's line. And so these are from other children of Saul. We commented that Mephibosheth, you may be wondering, like, how many Mephibosheths are there in this family? Like, really? We've mentioned before that Mephibosheth was not his given name. The Bosheth part means shame. There was another son of Saul named Ishbosheth, who we saw, who died earlier, which means son of shame or man of shame. And Bosheth, shame, is being put there instead of the name Baal. So what actually happened is that Saul and some of his descendants named a number of their children after Baal, after pagan gods. And so the author who's compiling 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Kingdoms, or 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, is trying to pass delicately over what Saul did while still acknowledging it by using that word shame rather than writing the name of the pagan god or writing the name of Baal. So yeah, we get the impression, we get hints that just the violence directed by Saul against David, while bad enough, was sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of Saul and what he was doing and his divided loyalties and worshiping other gods and all these sort of things. Verse 10, now Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of barley harvest until the rains poured on them from heaven. And she did not allow the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, and they were faint, and Dan, son of Joah, from the offspring of the giants, overtook them. We got giants showing up again. There's going to be some more before the end of the chapter, right? So it says here the offspring of the giants. It literally says from the offspring of the Nephilim is what's there, and Nephilim gets translated as giants, where into Greek, wherever it occurs. So this is what we're to understand here is that apparently the issues with Saul were continued in his family because, I mean, naturally the mother of these executed people obviously is going to have grief and mourning over it. But the way she chooses to express that grief and mourning in terms of their bodies, she's keeping the animals away from the bodies. It's not totally clear in there the way it's translated. It sounds like she's trying to keep them away from her picnic blanket or something. But she's trying to keep the animals away from the bodies that are left hanging under a curse. But the things with the oil on the stone, these are pagan rites. The anointing of standing stone markers is one of the primary Canaanite pagan rites. And so by doing this, she's actually memorializing their deaths and making it a sort of, trying to make it a sacred site, implying, and this reference to some of the Giant Clan members coming around is to sort of reinforce the idea that she's kind of doing this sort of demonic ritual. So yeah, this is a problem. That it wasn't just that, you know, Saul named some of his kids badly, but they were doing okay. We're supposed to get the impression that these who were executed for a reason, that they had not only been party to what had happened to the Gibeonites, but also they're involved in other things that constitute abominations. Verse 12, then David went and took Saul's bones and the bones of Jonathan his son. He took them from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who stole them from the square of Bethshan, where the Philistines put them, on the day the Philistines struck down Saul in Gilboa. So he brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from there. And they gathered the bones of those who were hanged. And they buried Saul's bones and the bones of Jonathan his son and the bones of those who were hanged in the country of Benjamin, in Zelah beside the tomb of Kish his father. So they did everything the king commanded. And after that, God heeded the prayer for the land. So David, on the other hand, we see this contrast, right, between the way Saul's family reacts to this and the way David's family reacts to this. The way the rest of Saul's family reacts to this is not to see it as just or right, but rather to sort of double down on the wrong road they've been headed down. The way David sees this is, I mean, Jonathan obviously was his friend, but Saul was definitely not his friend, right? And these 7 who were hanged were definitely not his friend. But David goes and gives them a burial anyway, right? And this means going and dealing with the Philistines to go and get Saul and Jonathan's bodies back from them and their bones back from them. And then making sure when it makes a point of where they're buried, because David buries Saul with Saul's father, right? And the good thing that could happen to you in terms of death was a pretty bleak thing in the Old Testament. You were pretty much, everyone was seen to go down into Sheol, but those who were righteous, the blessing you hoped for was that you would rest with your fathers. That was the phrase, right? And it's from resting with your fathers, Abraham being sort of their first father, their patriarch. This is where the idea of the bosom of Abraham comes from. So David, by doing this, is not only just sort of showing respect or kindness, but this was seen as one of the greatest acts you could do under the Torah, was giving someone who didn't have it and or didn't deserve it a proper burial. And the normal circumstance for someone who is hanged, someone who is publicly executed like this, they were considered to be under a curse, so they wouldn't be buried. They'd be left out for the animals. This is why the mother was out there trying to keep the animals away from the bodies. And they were considered to be under a curse. So David doing this is sort of removing that curse. This is David performing an act that's meant to bring about forgiveness for them, right? In terms of God's judgment, forgiveness for them, for Saul, for that family, right? Is what David does here at the end. And while this is an example of it, there are other important examples of it in the Bible. The book of Tobit, this is how we're told that Tobit was a very righteous man, because one of the things Tobit would do would be go out, find the bodies of those who had been slain, those who had fallen, and give them burials. Right? This was seen as this great good that you could do, for this great kindness that you could do for someone who, since that person is dead, they can't do anything for you in return either. This is purely one-sided. So what David is doing for them is purely one-sided. And we should also remember this, since again, we're coming up on Holy Week, when we think about St. Joseph of Arimathea, when we think of St. Nicodemus, when we think of the myrrh-bearing women, what it was they were doing for Christ. When St. Joseph risked his life to go ask Pilate for the body of someone he'd just condemned to death, which in a lot of situations would have resulted in St. Joseph being executed also, right? So, oh, you're with him, huh? Right? That when someone was just executed for treason, you didn't want to go to the guy who executed him and say you're his friend, right? But St. Joseph did. And then going and burying him after he had been hung on a cross, which represented a curse. We need to keep that in mind too, if we want to understand sort of the fullness of what's going on in Christ's burial. But we should definitely see here in David, we've talked a lot about how David is used as this type, as this icon of his descendant, of Christ. And this is another place, right? Because if David had an enemy, it would have been Saul. Several attempts to kill him, murdered lots of people trying to get to him. A lot of destruction, a lot of pure hatred, right? And David, in response, does this great act of love where he's going to receive nothing in return, right? He's going to receive nothing in return, but shows this love and seeks his forgiveness, not only of Saul, but of these descendants of his who clearly were not nice guys, were not good people, right? But David is, by doing this, interceding for them before God. And this act that David performs, right? We're not told that God heard the prayer to end the famine when those people were executed. We're not told that God heard the prayer and ended the famine when the Gibeonites joined the prayer, when the Gibeonites said it's okay. It's when David does this, takes this last step. When David takes this last step, that's when we're told that God hears the prayer and the famine ends. So I want to get through at least one chapter, and we've got some more giants, and people can get excited again. So verse 15, now the Philistines were still at war with Israel, and David and his servants with him went down and fought against the Philistines, and David grew faint. Then Ishbi thought he could kill David. This Ishbi was one of the descendants of the giants, and the weight of his spear was the weight of 300 bronze shekels, and he was girded with a club. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, saying, "You shall no longer go out with us to battle, that you do not quench the lamp of Israel." So, again, we're coming to the end of David's life. This is the last battle that David is going to participate in directly, where he's going to go out to war. He's been all this time when battle is going to be joined, he's always at least wanted to. They forced him at one point with Absalom's army to stay back, but he's always wanted to and tried to be out there leading his men in battle. And we should realize what this means, right? When he leads them into battle was, war is always a horrific thing. One of the dangerous things about modern technology is that war for us, at least from our side, in the industrialized world is getting more and more sort of mechanized and becoming more and more like a video game with drones and things that are very far away. And that's dangerous because we may lose sight of the real cost of human lives and destruction. But there wasn't any distance between warriors and what was happening in battle at the beginning of the Iron Age, right? So we're talking about people with iron weapons that didn't hold an edge very well. What it means that they didn't hold an edge very well was that you were always sort of half beating each other to death, running out into the mud and the blood and in mass, complete chaos, beating each other to death. David, the king of Israel, because he's going to ask men to go out and do that, he's out there in the mud and the blood, swinging a sword and doing that, right? He's not in the back plotting and making plans. He's right in there with them. Well, he's so deep in it with them that one of the Philistine champions, right, who's one of the giants, who has this sort of giant ancient spear, and you could go back to the second Bible study when we talked about Goliath and his armaments. This is the same kind of thing. He's got this bronze spear. Bronze was a technology that they didn't have anymore, that was associated with this previous age. It was associated with this technological knowledge that came from sort of demonic spirits to the Nephilim, to the giants. So this figure is not just, an enemy. It's not just the biggest guy, right? It's not primarily about size. This guy is this sort of demonized human. He is, as I mentioned earlier, Joshua and the people were supposed to get rid of these giant clans. At the very end of the book of Joshua, sort of the last stragglers of the giant clans who escaped and stayed members of these giant clans to try to carry on that way of life, still identified as Nephilim, and parts of these clans fled into Philistine territory and hid in Philistine territory. Goliath was one of them. This Ishbi is one of them. We're going to see a few more before we're through. But they're sort of the last stragglers are there among the Philistines. And this is one of them. And he very nearly kills David. It says David grew faint. David's now an older man. He's probably pushing 60. And a few hours of swinging a sword and fighting for your life will take a lot out of you, right? So he nearly gets killed. And so his men, his leading men in battle say, look, you're not coming, you're not coming into battle with us anymore. You're the king, right? This is the last time. We're not having you get killed out here. Because what would that do to Israel? What would that do to morale? What would happen if that happened? So no more. I guess this is the ancient world equivalent of having to take away your mom or dad's car keys because they can't drive safely anymore. Albeit with much higher stakes, obviously.
Father Stephen.
Yes, sir.
It also reminds me of the policy that changed that the captain was no longer allowed to go on away missions in Star Trek.
Yes, you got to take it. Yes. And yeah, so it changed from the original series. It was a landing party, and then it became an away team on the Next Generation. But yes, there was that regulation that Picard always ignored about not being allowed to beam down. So verse 18, after this, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gath or Gath, when Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Soph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And there was war at Gob with the Philistines, where Elhanan, the son of Jer-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, whose spear had a shaft like a weaver's beam. Yet again there was a battle at Gath, where there was a man of strife who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. He also was born to the giants. And he defied Israel, and Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, brother of David, killed him. These four were born as offspring of the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So this may seem like kind of an epilogue. In fact, the chapters we're going to be reading now for the rest of 2 Samuel or 2 Kingdoms are kind of seem like a series of epilogues because we're at the end of David's life, so we're kind of wrapping things up. But this is an important epilogue because, again, David functioning as an image of Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, who's his descendant, right? One of the things he does is brings to completion, right, this what's called a gigantomachy, what's called war with the giants, right? He brings to an end now, caps off, finishes what began with Joshua, right? Coming into the land. It was left unfinished because of Israel's disobedience. He comes and finishes it, right? And brings it to fruition and obeys what God had originally commanded. So that dynamic gets used a lot in the Gospels. This idea that Israel had failed to bring to completion what God had given them to do, but now Christ comes as the Messiah. He brings it to completion. He brings it to fulfillment. He succeeds where they failed, right? And so all through, we see this a lot in St. Matthew's Gospel, right? When he's talking about Christ coming out of Egypt I've called my son, he says. And if you go and look that up, that's not talking about the Messiah in the Old Testament. It's talking about Israel coming out of Egypt, right? But what St. Matthew's doing is not just riffing off the word Egypt. What St. Matthew is doing is saying that Christ is Israel in that sense. Christ is going to do what Israel should have done, but didn't. The other piece, and the little wilder piece, though, if you've listened to a bunch of my stuff, you've probably heard this already, is that one of the reasons why, when we get to the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, I should say, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, St. John's Gospel has no exorcisms in it. I'm about to talk about exorcisms. It's one of the interesting facts. There are no exorcisms in St. John's Gospel. But in the other three, there are all of these exorcisms. I mean, a whole bunch of them. We're all familiar with a bunch of them. We just read about one again on Sunday. And one of the things, if you go straight through the Bible, you might kind of wonder where that came from, right? Because there aren't a lot of exorcisms in the Old Testament. If you're going by most English Bibles, Old Testament, there aren't really any. The book of Tobit has one, but that's not a big thing in the Old Testament. Then also when you get to the Gospels, Christ is casting demons out of people seemingly all the time. And not only is he doing it, which wasn't done in the past, Christ does a lot of things that weren't done in the past, like healing a man born blind. But when he does it, everyone who sees him do it seems to take this as a sign that he's the Messiah. They say, surely this must be the Holy One. This must be, the Son of David, right? Because he's casting out demons. Well, why would casting out demons in their head mean that you're the Messiah, the Son of David? And to understand that, you have to know a little piece that you wouldn't necessarily know just from reading our Old Testament, unless you're Ethiopian. If you read the Ethiopian Orthodox Old Testament, you do get this. But this was well known and believed by pretty much everyone in Judea and Galilee and Samaria, for that matter, when during the life of Christ, was they believed that the demons who were going and possessing people, that these were the spirits of the Nephilim who had been killed in the flood and then thereafter. That these people being in these giant clans and these rituals they were doing and the evils they were practicing did sort of a reverse theosis, right? In the way that doing the works of God and worshiping God caused you to become like God, participating in this demonic worship and this wickedness and these abominations turned a human being, it made them like one of the demons. And so when these demonized, sort of fully demonized humans were killed, rather than our hope in the resurrection of becoming, as Christ says in St. Luke's gospel, sons of God equal to the angels, they became sort of these demonic spirits that would then possess people. So in the understanding of the people who saw firsthand Christ casting demons out of these people, the demons he was opposing and defeating and driving out of the land were the spirits of these creatures, these demonized people, these giants, who Joshua, with whom Christ shares a name, and then finally David were defeating and driving out of the land. So because they have that understanding, when they see Christ casting out demons, that's why they make the connection, right? They say, like David, he is now finally defeating them and sending them to the abyss, right? And ridding us from them forever. And so this must mean, so it's sort of, David did this in this sort of more literal physical sense, defeating them. Christ is now doing this in this greater cosmic sense, which means he must be the Christ, the one who's greater than David, the Messiah. So this little epilogue is important for that reason. It's David who finishes off the removal of the giants from Canaan. And it's Christ who finishes off all of what Israel was caused to do, who fulfills the Torah, the instructions they were given, but also who in this particular way, right, when they see that he has authority and is able to defeat these evil powers, they make this direct connection to David and through his men, David, in this case that we just read, being the ones who put the giants, these demonic beings, to flight. So we only got through one chapter, but I digressed a lot, and there was some, I hope, interesting stuff in this chapter. We've got some time for questions, comments, people telling me I'm crazy. I am, by the way. We can debate how and in what ways, but we've got a little time here.
I just want to remind everyone, you can unmute to ask your question, or please just type it in the chat for Father Stephen, and I'll kick it off like I did the last time. Father, would you be so kind as, I heard you mention Sheol in this Bible study, and can you explain the difference, if there is a difference, between Sheol and Hades and hell, and maybe talk through, because we're coming up on Pascha where Christ descends into, is it hell or is it Hades?
Yeah, I won't give you 4 hours of it like the Lord of Spirits podcast, but the short version, I mean, strictly speaking, Sheol, Hades, and hell are names for the underworld from different traditions. So the ancient Near Eastern traditions, including the Canaanites, but also including the Old Testament, refer to the underworld as Sheol. The Greeks refer to it as Hades. The Saxons, the Goths, the Anglo-Saxons referred to it as hell with one L. So technically speaking, those are all just names for the underworld. That said, when we say the word hell in English, people have, pictures of guys with red outfits and tails and pitchforks and people on fire, and they're getting poked with the pitchforks and all this kind of thing, which is all much, much later stuff. The view of Sheol in the ancient Near East, in the Middle East, and the ancient world was pretty bleak, in that it was basically, you're going to go live where all the demons and monsters you've been scared of your whole life live. Right? They believed that demons and evil spirits crawled up through cracks in the ground from Sheol. And so when you died, that's where you went. So there is within the Old Testament already, especially if you read like the Psalms of the sons of Korah, there's a lot of it there. There's the idea that in some way that the righteous of Israel, when they die, God will still be with them in Sheol in some sense, that they'll rest with their fathers in Sheol, that they will have within the grave. They didn't have a concept of like a different place, but it was functionally a different experience for them. And that evolves when you get into Second Temple Jewish literature, things written after most of the Old Testament was written, but before the New Testament, things like the Book of Enoch. You get the idea of the bosom of Abraham as sort of this separate section, usually that has like a fountain of water there. You see the water pop up in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man asks Lazarus, who's in Abraham's bosom, to bring him some water. So there's the idea that, well, there's some water over there in that part that's refreshing, right? So there's still this more positive place. And there's even within the Book of Enoch, there's even the idea that the fathers are going to leave that place and go back to paradise at some point in the future, which is going to plays into a lot of what we're going to sing at Pascha. That idea that yes, that's now accomplished in Christ. That kind of exodus from one place to the other. And so when things get translated into Greek, they just kind of take the Hades language is used and is just picked up as the Greek name for the underworld. You see in Christian literature certain elements that, again, there's hours of this on Lord of Spirits, the last episode and the next episode, if you want to really dig into it. But there's certain features of Hades as the pagan Greeks understood it that get kind of retooled and turned around and sometimes turned on their heads. And reused in Christian literature, ancient Jewish and Christian literature. Hades wasn't this sort of horrific place of demons for the Greeks. It was more just kind of sad and emo. Everyone was kind of depressed and down and sad. And it's like Manchester, England. But the sun never shines and that kind of thing. That sort of quality doesn't give it. But there was not what happens with the idea of hell, the way we usually think of it as modern Western folks, is that the imagery of the lake of fire, and pretty much only that imagery, right, which is the fate of the devil and his angels and the eternally condemned after the last judgment, gets like mixed in with Hades into this mush, and then you add sort of this real penal idea from Western theology of people being punished, like sins are seen as crimes, and so they're punished for their crimes. And then you get into all the debates about does the punishment fit the crime, and universalists and all that stuff happening. But none of that stuff really needs to be there. If you don't accept sort of the basic premises, you don't need to have any of those debates. But
there's a good follow-up question, Father, asking, is Gehenna different? Is something different?
Yeah, Gehenna is the way that when you're talking in Hebrew or Aramaic, Gehenna is a way of distinguishing between Sheol is the place where the dead go, like the underworld, and an idea like the abyss or Tartarus or the place where the bad people go after the judgment, right? Like the lake of fire. So Gehenna is more like that lake of fire of eventual ultimate condemnation. So yeah, there's a distinction there to be made. So yeah, I don't know how much. I mean, like I said, there's hours of stuff here. But I recommend, if you want to know more about this, you can listen to the most recent episode of the Lord of Spirits podcast and our next episode next week, Thursday, which is going to be our Pascha episode, where we go into potentially excruciating detail on this stuff.
So quickly, Father,
yes, sir.
Christ went to death. He did not go to the place prepared for Satan and his angels.
Right, they're not even there yet.
Because those are conflated in English.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no. Christ goes to Hades. Christ goes to the underworld, the abode of the dead. Yes. And he specifically goes there to get the people who are at Abraham's bosom and take them to paradise. He does some other things while he's there, but that's the Pascha connection is of this second Exodus, right? From Hades to paradise. So it's not from Egypt to the promised land, it's from death to life. It's from Hades to paradise. Yeah, and that's kind of a teaser of the next episode where we're going to go into a lot more detail on that. But yes, yeah, the lake of fire is currently unpopulated. It's just as paradise was sort of unpopulated for a period of time there. But yeah, that's the place. When you read the places where that lake of fire are mentioned, it's referred to in other ways, other places. The places where the lake of fire are mentioned are St. Matthew's Gospel and the book of Revelation. Both of them seem to get that imagery and that wording from the book of Enoch that uses almost the same wording. And they both use almost the same wording, both St. John and St. Matthew, about that lake of fire that's been prepared for the devil and his angels, not for humans. It's prepared for them. And that's where they're going to end up after the judgment, after the day of the Lord. So they're not there yet.
Was there any theological reason or benefit to the dead that caused people to take such drastic actions to go bury the dead who could not pay them back?
Well, it was an act of intercession, right? So if for example, with these bodies, if those bodies were left to hang, they would have been under a curse, right? And so taking them and giving them this burial with their fathers was seen as sort of interceding for them for forgiveness before God. So this is really an act of prayer for the dead. It's a ritual act of prayer for the dead, giving them that burial, including Saul also, of David praying for the dead. And it's that sort of seals the whole event and causes God to end the famine. David taking this step. Right. And so, yeah, prayers for the dead in general related to all this that we've been talking about, right? St. John of Damascus makes this pretty clear. We're able to repent because of our mortal bodies. Our mortal bodies make us changeable. They make us subject to corruption and death. They also allow us to change in the other way and to repent. And so once a person is outside of the body, once a person dies, they cannot repent. That's why the church understands prayers for the departed is so important. They can't repent anymore, but we can intercede for them and pray for them that God, when the judgment comes, would have mercy on them and forgive them their sins. And that's how that works. And that's how what David is doing here works. He's interceding for Saul and for these men who are executed, and for Jonathan, though Jonathan had less need seemingly than the others, that God would forgive them, give them their sins.
Well, we're right at time, Father Stephen, so you ended that right on the nose. I just wanted to remind everyone, with Father Stephen's blessing, we'll return to the third Thursday of the month starting in May. Hopefully, Father Stephen, you're available.
Yes, yeah. It just lined up just wrong during Lent. Both times.
as so many things do in our crazy lives. Yeah, so thank you very much again, Father Stephen, and we look forward to the next Bible study. We'll return not only to the third Thursday, but we'll start at the regular time of 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central Time. We've had to kind of do it differently the last couple of months. But thank you again, as always, Father Stephen, and good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
God.